introduce to you one of our most distinguished alums, Dr. Andrew Schafer, someone who has very deep Husky roots and has continued to be involved with Northeastern up to today. So he received his undergraduate here as a biology student and has gone on to fame. I don't know about fortune, but fame. He did his medical training after his undergraduate here at UPenn, and then did both an internal medicine residency and fellowships in hematology and research. Went on to be on the faculty of many prestigious institutions, including Harvard Med, Baylor, and Rice, and now is the chief of medicine at Cornell Medical School and also physician-in-chief at New York Presbyterian. And I said he has a lot of Northeastern connections and roots. So in addition to being an alum, his father was a professor here in criminology and sociology, so a lot of connections before he even maybe got to Northeastern. And he has been very supportive of the work we do here and of students. Today is an example, coming to talk to you and hopefully inspire you to follow in his footsteps. And he has also very generously funded a scholarship for a research co-op here at Northeastern. So we're really appreciative of that. He's had a long career not only on the side of a physician, but also on the side of a research scientist. 30 years of continuous NIH funding, which is very impressive, especially these days, in hematology with an emphasis on platelet biology. And he's here to talk to you about how those two things, the clinical side and the research side, can come together. And Dr. Schafer is one of the leaders now of a national dialogue on how important it is for us to train and support physician scientists. We need people who are working with patients in the clinic and understand their needs, bring that into the research lab to design the appropriate kind of experiments, and then bring those discoveries they make in the lab back from the bench to the bedside. He's written a book about that on the vanishing physician scientist, and I hope after you hear him speak today, you're all going to want to run out and get an MD, PhD. And so, without further ado, Dr. Schafer.
Thanks. Thank you all. If you don't mind, I'll take my coat off and I'm going to start sitting down, and I'll be moving around and talking to all of you. But basically, it's a tremendous thrill to be here. I was talking to Evan as we were walking around from the parking garage that I actually don't recognize most of the buildings, and it's just an incredible experience, almost surreal experience to be here. But what I thought I would do is, rather than spend this entire time talking to you, that I would talk for about 20 minutes or so, and in a very informal way and filled with anecdotes about my own experiences, if you'll permit me, and then leave lots of time for back and forth, because this is supposed to be a conversation, a career conversation, not a lecture, certainly. So in fact, I'm going to take my watch off to make sure I don't ramble too long here. But I wanted to sort of cover several linked areas that I think most of you, or maybe all of you, will be quite interested in. First of all, I wanted to give you a little bit of a glimpse of my own personal career journey and how Northeastern was an absolutely pivotal influence in my life, which I didn't appreciate at that time. And my career journey, like that of many, I would say most, really exciting or rewarding careers in medical science, has actually taken all sorts of serpentine and unplanned and unpredictable twists and turns during its course. Northeastern actually prepared me extraordinarily well for not so much the unexpected, but for how to deal with the unexpected. And one of the things that I will try to emphasize is that careers need to be individualized and one must follow their passions, and for most of us, as life goes on, we do very different things, and that's what makes things really interesting. So things evolve. Secondly, I wanted to give you a little bit of a glimpse of how my medical interests, which were the initial start, led me to science, and how they led me specifically to a real passion for scientific research. And again, it began here. Actually, it began in the building next door. It germinated here. It was the old, what was it called?
United Realty.
What's that?
United Realty.
United, yeah. We got this building right behind us, a warehouse, which looks great now, but it really looked like a warehouse then. And we had our lab in the depths of that building. And then thirdly, I thought I would give you a little bit of an idea about how I've tried over my career to straddle the arenas of medical practice, which I do. I see patients and clinical practice on the one hand, and an actual hands-on research, biomedical research on the other, and how one can try to do this and still be relatively productive in both. Because if you don't do either one well, then it's not worth doing that kind of thing. And then finally, emphasize to you why I think juggling careers simultaneously in both the clinical practice arena and the research arena is becoming increasingly challenging. But it is also becoming increasingly important, and it is becoming increasingly exciting. And it's something I hope that some of you will develop a real interest in. And then finally, I want to just say, and this will be throughout the conversation, is that there is what has turned out to be the single, immutable, unifying force, the cement to these various aspects of my career, doing scientific research, doing patient care, doing a lot of administration now. The one thing that's tied all this together, and it's really crystallized in my mind, and that has to do with teaching. And part of that is mentoring, and we'll talk about that, and how important it is for each of you to find the right kinds of mentors. I think that should be an important part of the conversation. It's very difficult to do, and you have to do it. But basically, the thing that we all have in common as clinicians and scientists, and even as academic administrators, is that we all teach. And I think that's the most important thing. So just as a very, very brief background, I was born and raised in Hungary. My family and I left after the Hungarian Revolution in 1957. The revolution was in '56. And then went to England and then to the United States to various places. My father had been a lawyer, and he was looking at reinventing his life as a professor, as a sociologist and a criminologist. So he was an academic itinerant, going from one university to another, and of course I would sort of trail behind. But basically, in my early life, I had never thought about doing anything other than medicine. I was just sort of almost, I don't know how I got interested in medicine, but there was nothing else. Because although my parents were not in the medical field, the social circles, the people that they knew, their friends were, and many of my more distant relatives were physicians, and I was sort of immersed in this from as far as I can remember. And I remember one of my father's best friends was the preeminent doctor in Hungary. He was the author of the major textbook of medicine in Hungary. It still is being published. And I remember going to their house and listening to all these fascinating stories about his patients. This was well before any privacy issues became a legal issue. So he would tell these fascinating stories about patients. He would name the patients, and they were really, really interesting, and how he dealt with them. And so I knew I was going to be a doctor, but I didn't know that I was going to do the other things. So when we came here, my father took a position at Northeastern, and we didn't have a lot of money, and so the most economical thing to do was for me to come to Northeastern as a student, and I had free tuition because he was a faculty member. I could live at home in Newton and could commute like most of my classmates did. And it was an experience which I will tell you quite frankly in the beginning was something that I was a very different environment from what I expected. And it turned out to be an irreplaceable environment, but I didn't know it at that time. And so I basically sought out research at Northeastern on my own, pretty much. There was no pre-med program, essentially, and the reason was that, as far as I can tell, there was only one other person who'd gone to medical school before me at Northeastern. I'm serious. He was someone who was 2 classes ahead of me, and we both neither one of us, we got to be friends, and we couldn't identify anyone in the past. Nobody knew anyone in the biology department or anywhere else in previous decades who had gone to medical school, so there was no pre-med. So it was a catch-as-catch-can kind of thing, but I was advised by some people that one of the things that I would have to do to be competitive for medical school was to do a research experience, and especially because my grades weren't all that great. I mean, they're good, and I had good grades, but they were far from great. I had C+ in genetics, actually, and I remember I had B- in inorganic chemistry, both semesters that I took it. So I actually had to seek out a mentor and a research lab. And the person that I came upon was a man named Charles Gaynor, who actually died about 2 years ago at the age of, I think, 93 or 94. Charles Gaynor was, at that time, a full professor, a very established and very well-known microbiologist on the faculty of the Department of Biology at Northeastern. And I was led to him because a lot of the work he had done was very good, and basically he didn't have a big lab, so I figured, I really could, get to know him pretty well. Dr. Gaynor was a wonderful person, but was hard to get to know. He was very formal, somewhat stiff, very elegant, almost patrician looking, and at first, until you really got to know him, almost humorless, and a little bit intimidating, frankly. The most informal clothes he ever had were a cardigan on top of his tie, white shirt and tie. And he was interested in bacterial genetics, and the 2 of us sort of teamed up, and I think I started in my 2nd year. And he spent unbelievable amounts of time with me. It was just unbelievable. So the routine that we got into was basically one-on-one tutorials, so that this went on for 3 years, where I would basically take all of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon off. After 12 noon, I didn't have any classes, and I would stay through the night. And I wouldn't start my classes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings until late, so I could sleep a little bit. But from noon on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I was there. And I would begin with lunch with him, and we would go through, and I forgot to bring it from the car, actually, but I had this textbook of bacterial genetics, a very rudimentary textbook that we decided that we're going to go through cover to cover and just tear apart. This was not much more than a decade after the structure of DNA was discovered, so you can imagine this was like a very early time. And basically, Dr. Gaynor had me just give lectures, assign me a series of lectures based on the book and some original articles, and I would give a 1-hour lecture just to him, with board and the whole business. It turned out that not only was this an incredible experience for me, but it turned out to be a really good experience for him as well, because he was learning bacterial genetics at the same time. We were learning, and the field was exploding, and it was just an amazing thing. It was a very dynamic environment. And then after we got through that, after about an hour, I would go into the lab and begin to do experiments. And I won't go into great detail on what we did, but basically we were doing research on the bacterium that causes crown gall tumors in plants. It's called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. And we were trying to identify the virulence genes in this agriculturally very important bacteria. It was absolutely from scratch. We were going by, we had neither one of us had any experience. We had no technicians. I was a technician, so I would autoclave everything. I would prepare agar and reagents and spend most of my time actually preparing things and washing dishes. And we would basically, I would just be in the lab, and he would be there most of the time. And it was a remarkable experience. Many days I would stay late into the night, and there were nights that I would actually stay until the next morning doing things. I had a girlfriend at that time who became my wife, who was a college student a few blocks away, and she would actually come and study with me. And it was good. It was actually pretty good. So anyway, so this was really fundamental research, really basic research in bacterial genetics. We understood then that there were things that were going to be applicable to human disease and to humans from what we learned in bacteria, from the agrobacterium. But we didn't have a very sophisticated understanding of how applicable this was going to be to humans. So this was very fundamental research, and when we talked about potential applicability of this in future decades to humans, that's when we were talking about translational research. We were just thinking about translational research as something that goes from the bench, basic findings in basic laboratory, and how you can translate them to clinical applications and patient care. But that was just a pipe dream at that time. I applied to medical school. I can't remember how many. It was an unbelievable number of medical schools. I had no idea what my chances were. And then I had an epiphany. There was a moment where I realized the importance of Northeastern. It was during my Harvard Medical School interview, one of my Harvard Medical School interviews. I was actually stunned that I was invited to be interviewed at Harvard Medical School. And I was interviewed by I won't mention his name, but he's deceased now, but a very, very important person at the Mass General Hospital who was a legend. He was a giant in his field. He was the chief of that service at the Mass General, and he had been that for decades. He came from a great medical family. He was his pedigree was pure Harvard, Harvard undergrad, Harvard Medical School, never left Harvard through training, and now was a Harvard professor. And he was, and he interviewed me and asked me about he didn't know anything about Northeastern, and he asked me why I was commuting, and why I had chosen to miss out on the great experience of living on a college campus. And I tried to politely say that I couldn't afford to live on a college campus, and it just wasn't sinking in. So I mean, obviously I wasn't going to get into argument with the person interviewing me. And he just kept lecturing me about don't understand all the things that I've missed and how I could have done this, and et cetera, et cetera. And I was mesmerized by this man. I was absolutely just listening to him. And as he was talking, it dawned upon me that this man was a jerk of breathtaking proportions. And I mean, and that what Northeastern had offered me was something very different from the pedigree that he had, but something which would turn out to be far, far more important. It offered me the companionship of fellow students who were driven, who were unbelievably motivated, because most of them were first-generation college. They came from disadvantaged backgrounds, blue-collar families, and their families were dependent on them. It taught me some resilience, and it even taught me just a little bit of courage in making decisions in my career going forward. I was not being spoon-fed, for sure. So I ended up going to Penn, the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and as I started going through medical school, the idea of research had actually receded from my mind. Medical school was very tough, and for the first 3 years we were going through the curriculum, and I wasn't going to be in the research lab. So I was beginning to forget my days with Charles Gaiman. And then in the fourth year of medical school, something amazing happened. And this was another one of those epiphanies. I don't know if any of you have had these before, but if you haven't, when you have them, you'll really appreciate them. And one of those aha moments when you realize something. But I was a fourth-year medical student at Penn, and I had already decided that I was going to go into internal medicine, but I had no idea what field I was going to go into. And so I was sampling things. It was elective time. The fourth-year medical school is often time for electives. And my first elective in the fall of my fourth year was to do a clinical rotation in hematology, blood diseases. And I went to one of the main teaching hospitals at Penn. The attending physician who was on assignment for that month was a man named Frank Gardner, who was also an extremely imposing person. He was a big Texan. He was about 6'7", and had a really stocky guy with a little bow tie, with a booming sort of baritone voice. A very intimidating person, a very accomplished hematologist, and he was my attending for that month. And I'll never forget the first day on that service. What medical students were asked to do was to see consultations around the hospital. In this case, it was hematology consultations, obviously. And we were supposed to go and see the patient, take a history, do a physical exam, prepare this for the afternoon, and then present it to the attending physician for the definitive stuff. So the first patient that I saw was a young man with sickle cell anemia. And I'd seen a few patients with sickle cell anemia. And this young man was in the hospital with some severe infection, and I can't remember the details. But what struck me as I was working him up was that this man had been in and out of the hospital all his life with all sorts of infections. I mean, he spent half his life in the hospital being treated for infections. So I worked him up, and in the afternoon came the formal rounds where Dr. Gardner, with his entourage of fellows and residents and lowly medical students, all in white coats, would converge in the nursing station of the floor where the patient had to be seen, and he insisted that the medical student present the case standing up at the nursing station in public without notes. And so I did. And I was looking up, just if you can imagine this, I was looking up at this Texan and talking. And then at the end he said, so do you have any questions about this patient? And I said, I wasn't sure what he meant. I said, well, I guess the thing that I don't understand about this patient is, why he's been in and out of the hospital and has had so many infections. I mean, we knew at that time, even then, that there was an immune defect in sickle cell anemia with the patient had infarcted their spleens, they didn't have functioning spleens, and so that we knew something about it. But I said, Dr. Gardner, it seems to me that there's just something different about this patient. I mean, it was just different. I mean, why is he plagued with all these infections, and most other sickle cell anemia patients don't have these kinds of infections? So that's my question. And then there was this long silence. It seemed like minutes, but I'm sure it was only just a few seconds. And he glared at me. He looked down at me. And then in his loudest voice, and the entire floor heard this, he yelled at me and he said, well, damn it, Schafer, why don't you find out? And I said, what do you mean find out? And what he said was, go into the laboratory and figure it out why he's got all these infections. And anyway, we went on rounds, but at the end of the day, he took me into his laboratory. We created a hypothesis about what kinds of, based on the kinds of infections that he had, that he probably had a leukocyte abnormality. And he taught me the rudiments of some leukocyte function assays. And he gave me his lab and his technician, and we set up experiments on this patient's blood to try to figure out what was wrong. And it turned out that there was a leukocyte defect, but we weren't the ones to discover it. We were scooped by somebody else. And I never published a paper on this, but I thought this was the aha moment. I said, God, this is an amazingly powerful thing. To be able to take care of patients and to ask questions that you don't understand about that patient. And there are a lot of things we don't understand. And to be able to take that into a laboratory and try to figure it out, that's really powerful. And this is translational research going in the other direction from what I did with Dr. Gaynor at Northeastern. This is bedside to bench translational research, as opposed to bench to bedside research. It's a two-way street. People working at the bench in the laboratories, people seeing patients, and in many cases they're the same person. But the questions that most, research questions that most MDs ask are inspired by their own personal experiences with patients that they don't understand. That's not to mean that PhD scientists are any less valuable. They're at least as valuable as MD scientists. They should be partners. They have a very different perspective, and I'll get to that in a minute. So basically, just to finish up, this is how I ended up going into medical research, and from there, for the next several decades, I spent a large part, at least 50% of my time, doing medical research, and the issue of this kind of existence of being what you call a physician scientist, which by definition is an MD or an MD PhD, sees patients, practices medicine, but at the same time also does some sort of research in a very meaningful way. Used to be reasonably easy to do, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for a couple of reasons. And I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll stop. But the important thing is that we absolutely can't give this up. If physicians, if MDs leave the arena of research, medical research, we will have lost in future generations an absolutely irreplaceable source of questions about biomedicine. And there is some worry about this happening. Part of the problem, as I've analyzed it, is actually a cultural one. It's kind of interesting when you think about it. The mentality and temperament it takes to be a really good scientist is actually quite different from the mentality and temperament it takes to be a good doctor. They're really different. As doctors, we're taught to that there's a need for immediate action. Something happens, you've got to move quickly. As a scientist, you're taught to avoid rushing to judgment. In medical practice, we're taught more and more today, even as medical students, to adhere to standards of practice. You have to adhere to the standards of practice as they're published. As a scientist, you're supposed to do the opposite. You're supposed to challenge existing paradigms. When we're seeing patients, when we're clinicians, we've been taught from the first day of medical school to have tremendous respect for hierarchy and for expert authority. And as a scientist, as a good scientist, you are expected to critique and to challenge accepted wisdom. Errors, mistakes. As doctors, we can't make them. We can't afford to make mistakes. Some mistakes that we make, errors that we make, can be fatal in clinical practice. For science, errors are often the inevitable manifestations of the creative process, and a lot of discoveries are made because of errors. If you could seize on those things. In clinical practice, we focus on the unique. As I said, on why is this sickle cell anemia patient, as opposed to other sickle cell anemia patients, so plagued with infections. And as a scientist, you focus on generalizable principles. So there are all sorts of the differences in how you think. And so if you're a physician scientist and you go back on any given day, you go back and forth from the lab to your clinic or whatever, you almost lead a schizophrenic existence. You have to sort of to switch your brain to think in a very, very different way. But it's actually a wonderful schizophrenic existence, I can tell you. The other one, which is more important, is why the species of physician scientists today is threatened and endangered, is that the gap, the scientific gap, and the pace of knowledge that's occurring in medical research today, with the era of molecular biology and molecular genetics, is so dizzy, it's so astonishing, that even for full-time scientists, you can't keep up with things. Even in your own special area as a full-time scientist, you'll have a hard time keeping up. And certainly if you're not doing it full time, it would be virtually impossible. At the same time, the same thing is going on in clinical practice. Clinicians who are full-time, like in private practice, who are full-time clinicians who don't do any research or science, are facing a tremendous armamentarium of new technologies and diagnostic methods and therapeutic methods and very sophisticated things that they didn't learn in medical school. So basically, the scientists and the practicing clinicians have drifted further and further apart in the last couple of decades. So there's a chasm, a scientific chasm that's occurred between, it's even a language barrier. A practicing physician today, even 15 or 20 years out of medical school, won't even understand the vocabulary of molecular genetics. Never learned it in medical school. At the same time, an MD who happens to be spending all of his or her time doing basic research and is not seeing patients has lost track of all the new the revolution in clinical medicine. So we have to bridge this gap, and only MDs or MD PhDs are obviously in a position to do that because they can straddle these two fields. And the only way I think to do anything meaningful is to be partnering closely with PhD scientists. So I'll finish and say that the lessons I've learned in my career is that first of all, that whatever career path you choose at this point, you cannot do it alone. Absolutely can't do it alone. And by that I mean, I don't mean having family and friends. I mean, those are of primary importance. But that's your social network. You need a career network. You need mentors. Mentors can come in different guises. There could be advisors, they're coaches, they're confidants, they're your champions, they're role models. It may not be the same person who can embody all of those characteristics. In fact, it rarely is. You may have to. Professor Gaynor and Dr. Frank Gardner and the other mentors that I've had have all been different in different ways. I've had role models as I trained in medicine who were not my mentors. But this was a network. You have to have that. And they won't come to you. They absolutely will not come to you. You have to seek them out. It's a very active process. You have to find your career network of mentors, coaches, champions, role models. How do you do it? We can talk about that a little bit. But it's hard work. But it's the best investment of time you'll ever spend in your career. And once you've found these individuals, starting right now and on through your career, and add them to your team, you have to cultivate them. You can't drop them. You have to be good mentees. You have to be good trainees. You have to do the reciprocal. And that doesn't mean you have to be obedient or anything like that. But you have to reciprocate honor and respect to that person. You have to develop a relationship with them. You have to persist, and you have to continue that relationship. It's an active process, but it is an absolutely essential thing. So, there's this, I think it's a myth, that there was this time decades ago when there were these, what they used to call triple threat physicians. These were the physicians who were unbelievable. The first part of the morning, they would be seeing patients in their office, a whole bunch of them. And then they would take their white coat off and they would go right into their laboratory and start pipetting and doing really basic research. And then a couple of hours later, they would have to give a lecture, so they would put on a jacket and go into a lecture room, give a lecture. And then then he'd go back to the office to talk to some patients on the phone, that kind of thing. I'm not sure if that ever really existed. I mean, we always, even I would go through years when I would emphasize one or the other much more. What has to happen now is, because science and clinical medicine have advanced at such dizzying paces, is that to be effective in doing these, you have to become part of a team. The idea of being the solo, sort of isolated researcher which is the old model, is probably obsolete. You just can't do it by yourself. So you have to find the right people to collaborate. Some will be MDs, some will be PhDs. You have to create your own team. Sometimes you will lead that team, and you'll be the principal investigator of research efforts. Sometimes you'll be a co-investigator, you'll be just a passenger. But I think it has to be teamwork. No, I think that the physician scientist remains an individual who will be a collaborator on many things as well as a principal investigator. The issue of how you get the basic scientists and the clinical people back together so that they can understand each other, I think has to go back, and this is a fundamental sort of theoretical thing, but it's beginning to happen, is that PhD graduate students and medical students ought to do some training together. They ought to get to know each other very early in their training courses, learn each other's cultures. In fact, it's beginning to happen. I as a medical student would spend time in the laboratory, but I never saw PhD students, graduate students, seeing patients. And of course, PhD students can't touch patients, but they can certainly be involved in rounds and clinical activities. And there are some programs now that are beginning to do that. I would argue that this is the person who actually has lived in both worlds and is in the best possible position, not unique position, but it's in the best possible position to be able to translate and to be the sort of intermediary going back and forth. I sort of liken translational research. We always use today we use this catchword of translational research, and nobody knows exactly what that is. But to me, it's exactly that. It's bench to bedside research and bedside to bench research, and a translational researcher is not much different from a translator, like an interpreter of foreign languages. If you want to be a great interpreter, and your ambition in life is to become an interpreter of the United Nations, be a Russian English translator, interpreter, you're gonna work at the United Nations, top of your field. It's not enough to just simply know the vocabulary of the English language completely and the vocabulary of the Russian language completely. It's not enough. It's important for you to have lived in an English-speaking country for a long time, and it's important for you to have lived in Russia for a long time. And so you need to live in the lab, and you need to live in the clinic, and just knowing the vocabulary is not enough. So I don't have a PhD. So the vast majority of physician scientists don't have PhDs. It's a very, very small group that have PhDs. So you can get involved in research at different stages. I was already interested. I was primed when I went to medical school. I was by Professor Gaynor. So I was primed by my Northeastern experience to really be interested in research. Many medical students have never had any kind of research experience, get interested even after medical school, after they've done their residency, when they do a fellowship. For example, the usual, as you know, the usual sequence is you go to medical school first, and then whatever field of medicine you choose, whether it's internal medicine or psychiatry or surgery or whatever it is, you then have to do a residency for at least 3 years. And then after that, you usually specialize and do a fellowship, clinical fellowship. And those fellowships require at least a year or two of research. And many physicians at that very late point in their lives and careers catch the bug. And they say, these are what we call late bloomers. And they basically, they just one of my best friends is a guy named David Ginsberg, who's a geneticist at the University of Michigan, who was actually one of my fellows when I was a junior faculty member at Harvard. And David was an incredible doctor. I mean, he is an incredible doctor. He'd gone to Duke Medical School. He did his residency at the Brigham, and then became a hematology fellow at the Brigham, and was a chief resident, and he was really viewed as the best doctor in his residency class. Just dazzling knowledge and judgment and everything. And when he came to us as a hematology fellow, we told him he has to go into the lab for 2 years. And he said, I'm not going to do that. That's a waste of time. I'm going to be a doctor, and I'm not going to do this. And we said, you don't have a choice, David. This is part of the curriculum. You have to be in the lab. And he actually was extremely resistant. And in fact, finally, he just gave up and said, all right, well, send me whichever lab you want to send me to. I'm just going to put in my 1.5 years or 2 years or whatever. So we did. We assigned him to the lab of Stu Orkin at Children's Hospital here in Boston. And during the first year that he was in Stu Orkin's lab, he cloned von Willebrand factor, which is one of the big clotting factors in blood. And that was the beginning of his career. And David Ginsburg is now became the youngest person ever elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and is now an amazing scientist. Still is a good clinician. So it can come late. It can come very late. Yeah, so it's actually similar, but they're different, because you're right. As a scientist, you need to contemplate, you need to think. Whatever gets your mind going, your creative process, silence or going to a football stadium, whatever it is, you have to think. In medicine, you have to obviously think about your patients and what the problem is, but you don't have a lot of time to think. You just don't. So the vast majority of medical practice is almost reflexive. I mean, you know what the guidelines are. You know what. I hate to say this. It sounds very cookbook. We always do. But most of the time, you end up doing that. You don't have the time either because you're extremely busy with a lot of patients, or because that patient is getting worse and worse by the minute, and you don't have time to think about it. And you do. You need to step back, and it's just like that sickle cell patient. That's what makes a good physician scientist, but it's a bit different. So how do you switch back and forth? So what I do, so to be able to do this schizophrenic existence doesn't involve intelligence at all. I'm still learning how to do it, believe me. So it doesn't involve intelligence. It's and it's not an inherited skill. It's an acquired skill. You have to learn it. It's time management. And that doesn't mean you have to be there 24 hours a day. It's just time management. That means that when you're seeing patients, when I see patients, there's nothing else in your life at that point. You're not daydreaming while you're seeing a patient about an experiment you're going to be doing the next day. You're a pure 100% physician at that point. When you're in the lab, again, you're not thinking about an appointment that you have tomorrow morning with a patient or a lecture you have to do. You're laser focused on your science. And if you can compartmentalize your mind that way, easier said than done, then you can actually do it very effectively. Great question, and that's a major issue now. And it's not just an issue for women; it's an issue for men as well. It's equally a gender issue, because today's generation of medical school graduates have just very different priorities from what previous generations had. They're looking at work-life balance issues. They're looking at controllable lifestyles, so the bottom line is it can be done. You don't have to sacrifice your life. If you do good time management, you can have a wonderful family life. I don't put myself up as the model for how it should be done, because I probably spent more time than I should have. But I was, when my kids, we lived in Wayland, which is about an hour drive from Boston when I was at Harvard, and when my son or my daughter were having a soccer match at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I would get there in time. I would just arrange things so that night I would be working at home, so it just having to adjust. What will eventually have to happen, and universities and medical schools are very slow to adapt into this. It's a source of frustration for me. Actually, other professions have adapted much more quickly, like the legal profession and business. And that is to allow each individual person, and certainly particularly women, but also men, to individualize their careers and to have personalized career paths, which are not necessarily the classic corporate ladder. You know, either you keep moving up on this ladder or you fall off and you're done, kind of thing. But to be able to move in a lattice, in other words, to, you know, so there are certain parts of your life, in your career, when you're going to be competing and working extremely hard on this, and then there'll be other times when you need to slow down or be part-time, or maybe even take a sidetrack and get away from it for a couple of years, understanding that when you re-enter the field, you're going to have to do a lot of work to almost like partially retrain at that point. But there have been surveys done, especially of women, executives, professionals, and business, and the vast majority of them, I can give you the references if you want, but the vast majority, 80–90%, said that if they had that kind of an opportunity in their lives to re-enter their career path at a later point after taking some time off, they would love to do that. And if our academic systems, our universities and medical schools don't adapt their current promotion systems and their tenure systems, there's a clock, you know, that was made decades ago by males with live-at-home wives who basically took care of them, essentially, which is completely obsolete. And, you know, unless they can adapt to this, I think we're going to lose an amazing firepower, critical mass of intellectual talent to potential physician scientists. The bottom line is that I think you can do it, and you have to insist on carving out a personalized lifestyle. So now I've gone, over to the dark side. I'm sort of an administrator most of the time. And again, this was not on the blueprint of my life. And I think if you're doing this well, the fun part of it is, I mean, you don't have a blueprint. You know, basically you go where your passions sort of lead you. I was asked to do some administrative work about 15 or 20 years ago to be a chief of medicine at that VA hospital in Houston. And I did it, and I actually liked it. I really enjoyed the mentoring and the ability to develop young faculty and things of that sort. Didn't like the budget so much, but I took the bad with the good. And I thought I was pretty good at it, and I actually have grown into a sort of 70–80% time administrator, medical administrator. I was, until 3 years ago, was able to continue doing bench research. I had 2 NIH grants, actually. And I realized 3 years ago that even though both of those NIH grants were in mid-cycle and I still had a couple of years left on them, that it was unfair to keep them because I wasn't doing good research. I mean, I was doing okay research. I was publishing a couple of papers, sort of Me Too kind of stuff, but it wasn't the right thing to do. So I actually turned those in. But now I'm doing research as a true collaborator. I actually have my quote-unquote lab in Ithaca, even though I live in New York City, at the medical school. The medical school is in New York, and Cornell's University, of course, is in Ithaca. And I work with biomedical engineers in Ithaca on a very exciting project. I go up there all the time, and we talk to each other. And then in addition to that, I see patients probably 10–15% of my time. And I do a lot of teaching at every level. So that adds up to about 180%. Penn was the first medical school in the country. It has an incredible, rich history of tradition of medicine, and yet it's not a stuffy place. It's not a sort of formal, stuffy place. And I thought this would be. I mean, I just had a good feeling about it. Having said that, I didn't have a lot of choices. I seriously, I must have applied to at least 60 medical schools. And in those days, there were no uniform admission. I mean, you literally had to handwrite every single essay. It was a different essay for each medical. I spent an entire summer applying, and I was rejected by the vast majority. In fact, my first notification of a decision, I'll never forget this, was I got a letter from the University of Colorado. I don't know why I applied to that. I applied to the University of Colorado, where they rejected my preliminary application. In other words, they wouldn't let me apply. And I thought, this is it. But I ended up liking Petteri. Northeast is a totally different place at this point. Totally different place in terms of its stature in the country. It's just amazing what's happened. You won't have to justify. What you need here is what you need everywhere else, whether you're in Ivy League school or here or anywhere else, is you need to be aggressive, personally aggressive. Without taking time, I'll mention what I can suggest about finding the right champions and mentors and guides to get you through the system. I mean, there are mentors who are scientific mentors, people who are mentoring your research projects, and then there are mentors who are what I call godfathers and godmothers. Those are the people who look over you. They make sure they connect you. They may not be exactly in your scientific field, but they're going to guide you through your career, or role models or things of that sort. You need to find those at Northeastern, and it's much easier now than it was when I was there. It's still hard, but with that, you're on the level. The playing field is now level, completely level. Northeastern now has a national reputation. I mean, I can tell you from Cornell and from Penn, in terms of being involved in admissions processes in the past. Northeastern has a reputation now of being a place where there are tremendously motivated students who are driven, energetic, and ambitious. And that trumps, for almost everyone, any sort of pedigree.